Hello everyone, I welcome you back to another important lecture. And for today, we would see that how come the past paper questions they have appeared from this topic of the active transport. And you may have learned that this active transport is the part of the chapter that goes as the movement of the substances. And if we were to look on toward the first question, this came in the May June of 2017, and the variant of your paper was 4.2. And they asked that figure 2.1 that we show you. This is a diagram of the protein, and this protein is used to move the ions across a membrane and there too in the root hair cells. Now, if I were to explain you this diagram, so here we have got this inside of the cells where there is higher concentration of the ions. And this darkened part is showing you the cell membrane. And here we have got the outside of the cell here where the concentration of the ions is lower. And if you were to follow this arrow, so the ions they are moving from their lower concentration to the higher concentration. So the point that must click in your mind is that since the particles they are moving from the lower to the higher concentration, so this is the active transport. And they have shown you the presence of the protein that is accommodating the movement of the ions. The reason is that whenever the ions have to be moving, so they cannot do so directly through the cell membrane, but rather than there is need or there is requirement of the protein, and these proteins they are the carrier proteins. So they facilitate the movement of the ions because at time the ions make a contact with these proteins that we have in the cell membrane. So these protein or the carrier protein, they would change the shape and that would allow the ions to move on the inside of the cells. Now they ask us for 1 mark that we are required to state the name of the process that moves mineral ions into the root hair cells through the cell surface membrane. So the process is active transport. Now for the total of 3 marks, what they have to be asking is that we are required to explain that how the protein molecules they move the ions across a membrane during this process. So since active transport is being utilized and the protein molecules are being utilized, so we need the energy being released from the mitochondria by respiration. So we would say that the protein molecules they use energy that is released by the respiration. And by that the ions they would move from the lower concentration which was on the outside to the higher concentration which was on the inside. And that too is happening across a membrane. So this all elaboration is for the active transport. And if we have to be giving weightage to the protein word which the examiner has used in the question, so we would say that these proteins they would change the shape when they interact with the ions. So that would facilitate the passage or the movement of the ions on the inside of the cells, and by this you would score total of 3 marks for this. Toward the next part that appeared in paper variant 4.1, and this came in May June of 2022. What they have to be telling us is that the chloride ions they also move along the pancreatic duct. Now, where the pancreatic duct is lying, we know that we have got this liver, and this liver acts as an accessory organs for our alimentary canal. And moving onward here, we have got the gallbladder. If I were to move further, so we have got this pancreas, and from the pancreas, there is presence of this duct that we have here. This is the pancreatic duct, and this pancreatic duct this carries the digestive juices from the pancreas to the first part of the small intestine, which is duodenum. Now, what they have to tell us further is that there is presence of the proteins, and these are the CFTR proteins, and they would be available in the cells that are lining the pancreatic duct, and they move the chloride ions out of the cells into the duct. If I were to just see and to move you here, so we have got some cells here in the pancreatic duct. Okay, and these cells in the pancreatic duct, they have got some proteins in them, and they are saying that these proteins they are entitled as CFTR proteins. And these CFTR proteins, they are actually moving the chloride ions out of them, and these chloride ions they are getting accumulated in the lumen of this pancreatic duct. So what you have to get an idea here is that when there would be the presence of the chloride ion here in the duct, so this chloride ion would lower the water potential in them. And for the cells, the water potential would increase. and the water would move out of these cells with the help of osmosis and it would come here. And that would make the pancreatic secretions or the pancreatic juice so that they could flow easily to the duodenum of the small intestine. Now, if we were to look on toward figure 3.2, which they have given us here, they say that this is a diagram of the cell that is lying in the lining of the pancreatic duct, showing the location and the activity of the CFTR protein. So, if you were to look clearly, this is the pancreatic duct cell. These are their carrier protein, and which are the CFTR protein. And these CFTR protein, they are moving these chloride ions out of them into the duct of the pancreas. So they say for the total of 3 marks that we have to explain that how the CFTR protein they move the chloride ions across the membrane of the cells which are shown in 3.2. So if I were to simply see on the outside of these pancreatic cells, the concentration of the chloride ion is higher, and on the inside, the concentration of the chloride ion is lower, and these ions are also moving with the help of the carrier protein. So all of these, they are the hints that we need to be talking with context to the active transport. So if I were to just simply take you to the answer, so I would say that these CFTR proteins, they would move the chloride ion against the concentration gradient. Why? Because they are being moved from the lower to the higher, and that is against the concentration gradient. And for sure, that would be done with the help of energy, which would be released by the mitochondria. And we know mitochondria, they basically release energy with the help of aerobic respiration. And these carrier proteins that we have got, now they would interact, or they when they make the contact with the ions, they change their shape, and that would facilitate the passage of the ions out of the pancreatic cells, and ultimately they are moving into the pancreatic duct. Moving further, for the total of 3 marks, they say is that the movement of the chloride ions into the pancreatic duct causes the water to move from the cells into the duct, and that would help the flow of liquids in the duct. They say explain how the water moves from the cells shown in figure 3.2 into the pancreatic duct, and as I have explained above, you see that we have got a lot of chloride ions here that would reduce the water potential on the outside of these pancreatic duct cells, and inside the cells the water potential, it would for sure increase, and that implies that now the water would move out of the pancreatic cells into the pancreatic duct with the help of the osmosis, because the presence of the chloride ions here, their higher concentration, it actually reduces the water potential. So simply if I just take you to the answer, for 3 marks you would say that the presence of the chloride ions in the duct, it lowers the water potential, and it causes the water to move out of them by osmosis, where they would move from an area of higher water potential, which was lying within the pancreatic cells, to the lower water potential, which was there in the pancreatic duct, and that has been done across a partially permeable membrane. So by this, you would score total of 3 marks here. Moving onward to this part, and this came in the May June of 2023. This was variant 4.1, and this is question number 2 with us. And we have to see in context of part B that what they have to ask from us in context of the active transport. For 3 marks, they're asking that we have to describe how the process of active transport this differs from the process of osmosis. So we know it very well that the active transport it uses energy which is released from the respiration, and the active transport would move the particles against the concentration gradient, and the active transport would cause the movement of the ions with the help of the carrier proteins, and none of these situations we see in case of osmosis. Moving onward to the C part, they say state the type of the plant cell that uses active transport to absorb the mineral ions from the environment. So this is fact that these are the root hair cells, because the root hair cells they have the abundant mitochondria and they have the carrier protein. The mitochondria would release energy and the carrier proteins would allow the movement of the ions. So the answer here is root hair cell. And for the 2 marks they ask is that we are required to explain the effect of the lack of magnesium ions on the color of the plant leaves. Now, what we need to be understanding here is that these magnesium ions they are important for making the chloroplasts or the chlorophylls within the leaves, and those that chlorophyll pigment is green and that would make the leaves look green. So if there is deficiency or lack of magnesium, so the leaves they would turn yellow. And why they are turning yellow? because there was lack of the magnesium ions, and these plants they were not able to make the chloroplast or the chlorophyll. So that is why the plant leaves they appear yellow. Moving onward to the next question, and this appeared in the May June of 2023. This was theory paper variant 4.3, and this was question number 1 with us. What they have to be saying is that the movement of the molecules within the organism can occur both by diffusion and the active transport. And we are required to complete table 1.1, where we have to put a tick to show that what feature is shown by the diffusion or the active transport. So we have got the feature here, we have active transport here, we have diffusion here. And they say movement of the particle always occurs across a membrane. So always word basically implies that we need to be putting a tick here because the diffusion can happen across a membrane, but the presence of the membrane is not an obligation for the diffusion process. They say movement of the molecules during gaseous exchange. So the gaseous exchange always is by diffusion. And they say rate of the movement of the particle is higher when the concentration gradient is larger. We know that the active transport moves the molecules against the concentration gradient. So the steepness of the gradient would account for the diffusion process. So we need to put a tick here. They say it requires energy from respiration, and that would need us to be putting a tick here because this is the active transport. Why it requires energy from the respiration? Because this mechanism moves the ions against the concentration gradient. So for that purpose, we need the energy for the carrier proteins to work so that they can move the ions from the lower to the higher concentration. Now, here they ask for the total of 3 marks, where we need to explain that why the active transport is important in the root hair cells. So, if I were to explain this with the help of the diagram, so what we know is that the root hair cells they have got two of the important functions to be rendering. One is the movement of the ions, and the other thing is the movement of the water molecules. And at the center of these root hair cells, what we have got is the large vacuole. Now, the situation is that the mitochondria that we have within the root hair cells, they would release energy, and by that, the ions that we have got, they would move from the soil where they are in lower concentration to the large vacuole, where the ions are in higher concentration. And when we would fill up the large vacuole with more of the ions, so this would lower the water potential within the large vacuole. And now, once we have lowered the water potential in the large vacuole, the water molecules they would be more in the surrounding soil. That would increase the water potential here, and by that the water would enter into the large vacuole with the help of osmosis. So if I just take you to the wording that you were required to be writing for this, so you would say that this active transport is important for the movement of ions from the lower concentration that lies in the soil to the higher concentration that lies within the root hair cells. And when the ions are moved through the carrier protein, so they would lower the water potential in the large vacuole, and that would cause the water to enter into them with the help of osmosis process. So by this, you would score total of 3 marks. I hope you may have got an idea of that how come the past paper questions they can appear from this topic of the active transport.